70% of successful people have experienced imposter syndrome at some point in their careers. But here's what they don't tell you. The ones who suffer most aren't the people struggling to succeed. They're the ones who are already excellent, convinced they're frauds.
Timeless, timeless, timeless.
Welcome to the discussion. If you're here today, I'm guessing something resonated in that statement. Maybe you're exhausted from trying to be flawless. Maybe you're tired of the constant voice in your head telling you that you're one mistake away from everyone discovering you're not as capable as they think. Maybe you've walked away from opportunities that others would dream of, and you can't quite explain why. I see you. And I want you to know you didn't find this video by chance. You're here because part of you is ready to understand what's really happening beneath all that striving, all that pushing, all that never quite good enough feeling that follows you everywhere. Today, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood forms of self-sabotage, the trap of perfectionism, and how imposter syndrome doesn't just make you doubt yourself, it makes you destroy the very things you've worked hardest to build. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing. These conversations aren't always easy, but they're necessary. And you deserve access to content that speaks to the real struggles, not just the highlight reel. Let me tell you something that might sound contradictory at first. Perfectionism has nothing to do with excellence. In fact, perfectionism is excellence's greatest enemy. See, excellence is about growth, about improving, about bringing your best to the table while accepting that best evolves over time. Perfectionism, on the other hand, is about control. It's about managing other people's perceptions of you because you're terrified that if they see the real you, the messy, still learning, sometimes struggling you, they'll realize you don't belong. I worked with someone who embodied this struggle in ways that nearly destroyed his entire career. Let me tell you about David. David was extraordinary at what he did. I'm not exaggerating. When he walked into a room, people noticed. He had this intensity, this commitment to excellence that was almost magnetic. And he'd earned it too. Every job he landed was more lucrative than the last, more prestigious, more responsibility. On paper, David was exactly where he'd always dreamed of being, but here's what no one else saw. David was dying inside. Every new position would start the same way. He'd throw himself into it completely. Nights, weekends, every ounce of energy he had. He'd develop presentations that were flawless, proposals that covered every possible angle, solutions that anticipated problems no one else had even thought of yet. He was always 3 steps ahead, always prepared, always ready to prove his worth. And then it would happen. A supervisor would offer constructive feedback. Just normal, helpful guidance. The kind that helps good work become great work. Or maybe they'd pass on one of his ideas in favor of a different direction. Nothing harsh, nothing unusual, just normal workplace collaboration. And David would crumble. Not outwardly at first. Outwardly, he'd nod, say, "I understand," go back to his desk. But inside, every piece of feedback felt like proof of what he'd secretly believed all along, that he didn't actually belong there, that he'd fooled everyone into thinking he was capable, and now they were starting to see through the act. So he'd quit, abruptly, sometimes without even having another job lined up. He'd convince himself that the company didn't value innovation, or that leadership was incompetent, or that the culture wasn't right. But the real reason, he was running running before they could fire him, running before he had to face the humiliation of being exposed as the fraud he believed he was. This is how David sabotaged himself. When David first came to me, he just walked away from his 5th position in 4 years. 5th, each one better than the last. And he was sitting across from me saying, "I don't know what's wrong with these companies. Why does no one appreciate quality work anymore?" And I looked at him and said something that made him angry at first. "David, what if the problem isn't the companies?" That crossroads moment, that pause where he had to decide whether to get defensive or get honest, that's where his real transformation began. Because here's what David and I uncovered together. His perfectionism wasn't about excellence. It was armor. When you're a perfectionist, you're not actually trying to do great work. You're trying to do work so flawless that no one can criticize it. Because criticism, even constructive criticism, even helpful feedback, feels like a death sentence when you're convinced you're an imposter. Have you considered this different approach becomes you're not good enough. I think we should go in another direction becomes we're rejecting you as a person. And when you hear rejection in every interaction, when you interpret collaboration as condemnation, you can't stay anywhere long enough to actually build something meaningful. The imposter syndrome wasn't making David humble or motivated. It was making him destructive. To his career, yes, but more importantly, to his sense of self. Because every time he quit, it reinforced the narrative. See? I can't make it anywhere. I'm not actually talented. I'm just good at faking it until people figure me out. I want to take a brief moment here. If this is striking a chord with you, if you're recognizing these patterns in yourself or someone you care about, would you share this? Sometimes we need permission to stop pretending we have it all together. Sometimes we need to know we're not the only one fighting this particular battle. Now, working with David wasn't about teaching him to accept criticism better or to just have thicker skin. That's not how you heal imposter syndrome. Instead, we had to go deeper. We had to ask, where did this belief come from? When did being good at something become having to be perfect at everything to justify your existence? For David, it traced back to childhood. High-achieving parents, conditional love wrapped up in report cards and trophies, a home where mistakes weren't learning opportunities, they were disappointments. He'd learned early that his value was tied directly to his performance. So, of course, as an adult, any feedback on his performance felt like a referendum on his worth as a human being. Understanding this gave David something he'd never had: clarity. Not about how to be more perfect, but about why he'd been chasing perfection in the first place. And here's where we get to your mental actionable step, the practice that helped David begin to reset his relationship with his work and, more importantly, with himself. It's called the feedback separation practice. And here's how it works. When you receive any kind of feedback, positive or negative, before you respond, before you internalize it, I want you to write down these 4 separate statements. What was actually said? Just the facts. No interpretation. My manager suggested I revise the presentation to include more data. What I'm making it mean about me, this is where you're honest about the story you're telling yourself. I'm making this mean I'm not analytical enough, that I missed something obvious, that I'm not as smart as they thought. What this feedback is actually about strip away the emotion and look objectively. This feedback is about making the presentation more persuasive to a data-driven audience. How I can use this to grow, focus on action, not identity. I can strengthen this specific presentation and also develop my ability to anticipate what different audiences need. See the difference? The feedback didn't change, but by separating the actual feedback from your interpretation of it, you stop making every suggestion a judgment on your fundamental work. David started practicing this religiously. At first it felt mechanical, forced, but little by little something shifted. He started to notice that constructive feedback wasn't rejection, it was collaboration. That someone caring enough to help you improve your work was actually a sign of respect, not contempt. He learned to align his identity with his growth, not with being perpetually flawless. He began to understand that true wisdom isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being humble enough to keep learning from them. 6 months after we started working together, David was still at the same job. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't. Not because he never received critical feedback, he did regularly, but because he'd finally learned to separate his performance from his personhood. He'd learned that he could be excellent without being perfect, that he could grow without it, meaning he'd been inadequate before. He'd learned to move beyond limits he'd placed on himself, realizing that finding purpose in his work didn't require being flawless. It required being authentic, being teachable, being willing to show up imperfectly and keep showing up anyway. The impact wasn't just professional. His relationships improved, his health improved, because when you're not spending every waking moment trying to control everyone's perception of you, you actually have energy left for living. This is the thing about imposter syndrome and perfectionism. They promise to protect you from judgment, but they end up isolating you from connection. They promise to help you succeed, but they sabotage your success at every turn. They promise to keep you safe, but they create a prison where you're never quite good enough to deserve the air you breathe. And the key to breaking free isn't achieving more or proving yourself once and for all. It's accepting that you're a human being who is valuable simply by virtue of being human, not because of what you produce, not because of how flawlessly you perform, but because you exist. I know this might be hard to hear, especially if you're in the thick of it right now. If you're exhausted from trying to be perfect, if you're terrified that letting your guard down means everyone will finally see that you don't belong. But here's what I need you to understand. You're not an imposter. You're a capable person who's been convinced that capability isn't enough. You're someone worthy of success, who's been taught to believe you have to earn your worth over and over again, in every interaction, in every project, forever. That's not living. And you deserve better. You are not alone in this struggle. Some of the most accomplished people I know fight this battle daily. The difference isn't that they've conquered it completely, it's that they've learned to take action in spite of it, to move forward even when the voice says they're not ready, they're not good enough, they're going to be found out. Let me leave you with this. Perfection is not the price of admission to success. It's the prison that keeps you from ever arriving. Your worth isn't measured by your flawlessness. It never was. And the moment you accept that, the moment you give yourself permission to be brilliantly, messily, authentically imperfect, that's when you finally become free to do your best work. Not because you have to prove something, but because you genuinely want to contribute. Thank you for letting me into your world today. for being brave enough to look at these hard truths. That courage matters more than you know. If this spoke to something in you, please subscribe to the Yewtree Legacy channel. Like this video if it brought you clarity, and if you know someone trapped in the perfectionism cycle, someone who keeps sabotaging their own success, share this with them. Let them know they're not alone. We have resources, books, and tools, all created by people who've lived this struggle and found their way through. There's no judgment here, just understanding, support, and practical wisdom for the journey ahead. You're enough, you always have been. Now go live like you believe it. We have resources, books, and tools, all created by people who've lived this struggle and found their way through. There's no judgment here, just understanding, support, and practical wisdom for the journey ahead. You're enough, you always have been. Now go live like you believe it.
Also, keep the momentum going. Check out the next discussion in our series on the timeline, as well as another one of our recommended videos. Thank you for spending time with Yewtree Legacy. For weekly inspiration and free resources, visit yewtreelegacy.com. You'll also find our latest blog and a free 7-day guide to help you start strong. See you again soon.